Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So we have returned to Margaret Frazer's Dame Frevisse Medieval Mystery series because, as I keep saying, it is so much easier to just pick a series and run with it than sit there trying to figure out what I'm going to read this week while still trying to plug my way through books I'm not really interested in. So the Reeve's Tale has one of my favorite things in it because it's one of the moments when you can hear dozens and dozens of fictional murder mystery detectives from, Sherlock Holmes onward, all of them just screaming in agony over the idea that this is evidence. And that is the moment when Master Montfort, the Crowner, that is, the guy whose job it is to solve murders, because the medieval period, as Margaret Frazer repeatedly says in her endnotes, which, by the way, endnotes in these books, really, really good. Interesting, usually come with some recommendations for books that are, specialist about some particular area that she had to research in particular for that book. Anyways, she repeatedly, one of the things that she brings up at other points in this series is that the medieval period was not as a whole a just big ball of lawlessness. There were periods of lawlessness in the medieval period, but every nation on earth has periods of time when some sector or other was fundamentally lawless. We all know the Wild West, because the thing about the Wild West was that it was, so far distant from most of the machinery of the state that people had to kind of make their own organizations and laws themselves because you were simply too far out from the center of where laws were being made and enforced. Canada was like that, and there were periods in this case, England's history, when that happened. But for the most part, there was a pretty functional legal system. I mean, yes, today we might complain about aspects of people's rights or whatnot, but the fact of the matter is that the medieval period is where we see the foundations of the modern Anglo common law legal system, and there have been full-bore organized legal systems since the Code of Hammurabi. Anyways, so you had the Crowner, and if somebody died in a way that was unexpected and violent and looked like it might possibly be a murder, the Crowner was called. This is kind of like today when if somebody seems likely to have died unexpectedly or what have you, very often the police get called just as a precaution. But Master Montfort, as we have seen since the first book onward, is not the sharpest tack. This is a man who, part of it is that he's not the sharpest tack, but part of it is also that most people are fairly agreed, and he does give the impression that one of his main motivators is the fact that he can claim a bunch of stuff for himself in order to get the money for basically selling crap to the crown, because if somebody is a guilty party, then all of their stuff is forfeit to the crown. And so he has a tendency to fixate in on finishing things up as fast as possible, because the faster he finishes, the faster he can get out of there and go back to doing something he wants to do. And also because he wants to get people's stuff and get that stuff sold as fast as possible. And so, Master Montfort, not the best character in the world. And then we get this moment in the book where Master Montfort announces, well, they found his hood and his belt next to the dead body, so clearly those two are the ones who committed the murder. And the question winds up being and Frevisse winds up, because Montfort told her not to speak, she winds up basically sort of turning her head to the side and asking the air as though inquiring of God to answer her questions. But why would he leave his belt behind, she asks, because, indeed, why would somebody leave his belt behind at the scene of a murder? You know, you wear a belt because the belt, it belts your tunic close and keeps it from flopping everywhere and holds your pants up and all that kind of stuff. Who would take their belt off and leave it behind at a murder scene? Especially a murder scene where it's fairly clear this man was killed by being beaten half to death and stabbed. You know, if he'd been strangled with something, you might have an argument for the belt, but not for beating and stabbing. And so, you have that, and then you have the question of why this guy's hood was left there for exactly the same reason. This is like somebody saying, I'm just going to abandon my hat at the scene of the crime. I mean, and the thing about a hood, though, is that it's a hood. It's tied on. It's not like losing a baseball cap where something could, flip it off your head, and if you're in a hurry, then maybe you don't notice until later that your baseball cap is missing. You tie a hood on. And so these two things being evidence that they were there is patently ridiculous, because it's evidence that somebody picked up their stuff and brought it there, if anything. And so it's this moment of Montfort's supreme, just, what are you even thinking, that's going on here. That moment when some of it's that he wasn't too bright, and some of it's that he's so greedy, and he winds up losing control of his little jury of witnesses who are all saying, well, yeah, we saw that the belt was there, but the man's super expensive belt is no evidence that he was there, because why would he leave his belt behind? Anyway, so that's a significant part of this. That's one of my favorite things of all time in this series. And the thing is, I'm skipping over most of this. The Reeve's tale, a good portion of this is from the perspective of the Reeve, and this whole thing kicks off that gets Frevisse into place because the steward, there's a village which is partly owned by Lord Lovell, who is, a local lord and has a bunch of villains, that is, serfs, that is, effectively slaves. Like, serfs and villains and all of those sorts of words are people who are indentured. They cannot go anywhere. They are not free. There is the concept of a free man who is not basically owned by his lord. And then you have serfs and villains, and they are not free. They have to buy themselves free. They're perhaps not slaves, but they don't have freedom of movement or freedom to go places and do whatever they want and choose their own paths in life. They do what their lord tells them to do because they are not free. Anyways, so you have Lord Lovell's half of this, and then you have the Priory basically owns the other half of the town. And because you have these two things, Dame Frevisse's Priory, her nunnery, and Lord Lovell's thing, you have these two groups living in the same town, and so there's a lot of interchange, and so the Priory's steward normally works with the Lord Lovell's Reeve to sort of, handle all of these issues that come up because they're in this shared space. And the steward gets accused of being a runaway villain, runaway serf, and he's like, no, I am not. I am a free man from, X towns over. I don't know who witnessed this, but they're a liar. And so that's how Dame Frevisse gets sent, because their new prioress, Domina Elizabeth, basically knows darned well that Frevisse is the most worldly of the nuns that's there that she is smart and worldly and clever and practical and all of the things that you need for somebody who's going to temporarily handle the job of stewardship. And so Frevisse gets sent, and because she is a nun, she requires another woman, and most best of all, another nun, to go with her. And Dame Elizabeth says, and Domina Elizabeth says, very well, and take Sister Thomasine with you. Sister Thomasine, who continues to irritate Frevisse by having no grasp of the real world much of the time. Sister Thomasine, who everybody thinks is going to be a saint. Sister Thomasine, who when she was first sent to the nunnery was actively afraid of the outside world. I mean, she has a true vocation, but she was also afraid of the outside world. And Elizabeth basically says, she spends too much time praying. I don't think it's going to be good for her. And pitches them both out, leaving Frevisse basically thoroughgoingly baffled because, why would you, because she doesn't want to go, and why are you sending Thomasine, who is like the least likely person you would want to send in this? And what's very, very interesting in this is Thomasine, once again, all over again, raises that interesting push-pull in these books that come up over and over and over again, and I love it, and that is the push-pull of the call to God with the call to exist in the material world, because, it's all very well and good to say that, one should reach for higher things and reach for God and enlightenment and so on, but we live in the world. We exist here. And when people do things around us, we have to respond to them. And Frevisse, as much as she is determined that people should have justice in the great hereafter, is equally determined that there should be justice in the present. That, it is as much her calling to ensure that people get what they, that people who are murdered, that their murderers are found, and so that families can rest easy knowing who did this, but also so that truth is known and truth is told. It's so very important to her. And, she's out in the world, and Thomasina looks at her and says, it's all very pretty, but I don't understand why anybody cares about any of it when they can have God. And Frevisse has this moment where she finds herself wondering, is it a failing on Thomasine's part to not understand why somebody might not want to be a nun or a priest or monk or what have you? Or is it a failing on Frevisse's part as a nun that she can't think that way? Because we've had this push-pull over and over and over again with, people, with all of these young women who have been made to be nuns because their families basically said, look, we can't manage to get you married off, or we can't afford to get you married off, so we're giving whatever little dowry we can pull together to the church, and you're going to the church. And you have that, and you have the story of Jane in the last couple books, who, was sent to the church and finally stood up and said, no, I refuse, and left and managed to make her own way and, and become engaged to be married and so on and so forth. And you have this constant push and pull of, Frevisse's very genuine call and being surrounded by these people who are being pushed towards the church but who don't want it, and then you have someone like Thomasine who has flung herself headlong into the role to the point that she doesn't understand why somebody would want otherwise. And it's such an interesting back and forth, and one of my favorite themes in this series that just comes up over and over and over again, and I just really, really like it. And that's all that I'm going to say, because I'm basically hitting my self-appointed time limit, so that is everything, and I will see you all next week.